Hey guys, welcome to BP the Bible Perspective. Trevor Noah versus Thomas Sowell on the subject of reparations, racism, and slavery. Let's get into part two of this matchup. Now, before we do, please like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. Now, this is not a face-to-face debate. This was a video that I came across where the person spliced segments that how Trevor Noah addressed reparations and slavery and racism on his show, The Daily Show, and spliced it with an interview that Thomas Sowell did. I believe it was on the Hoover Institute, but on the same subject. In other words, it was how they addressed slavery, racism, reparations. And of course, with Dr. Sowell, it's amazing and astonishing with him as a black conservative. And you can probably say you can understand why black conservatives get such a bad name, or they get a bad reaction. Dr. Sowell was born in 1930. So from 1930 to 1965, this was the height, right? This was the height of Jim Crow, the horrors of Jim Crow. So Thomas Sowell was 35 years old when the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 1965. Yet, the way he responds to racism and slavery, we're going to hear it in his own words, basically downplaying it, diminishing it. And by the way, and not pointing out his survival of that very era. In other words, if America wasn't that bad, why did he leave the South? His academic achievements did not come from Southern schools. They came from Northern schools and schools out in the West. In other words, if affirmative action, which he's against, is so bad, then tell me, out of all of the colleges that he applied to, why didn't he get in? Why didn't he get into when he tried to get on the Dodgers baseball team? Why did he experience racism in the service during the Korean War? So that's what makes his response to me disturbing. But I want to unpack it because it has become a typical conservative response to today's racism. And as I said, whenever the white evangelical, the white conservative want to downplay racism, they will bring someone out like Thomas Sowell, as well as other black conservatives who jump at the chance to try to diminish and downplay what they know is to be a lie, to try to diminish or the effects of slavery. Thomas Sowell knows this very well. Now I want to get back into this video. I'm going to pick it back up where I left off. I'm going to scroll through here. But again, I want to unpack this. I'm going to take my time and I want to unpack what they said. So let's get in it. Here we go.
So to your question, I think you have to understand what the word reparations means first. So reparations
Africa, the Middle East, Asia, slavery took place everywhere.
And it continued elsewhere.
I'm going to pick it up here. And I dealt with this in part one, but I want this is important what he is saying here. And I'm going to pick it up on the other side of Trevor Noah's response. Here we go.
After it was abolished in the Western countries.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Now, what he was saying was that in the Western countries, slavery was abolished, whereas in other parts of the world, slavery was not. That's a lame excuse there. being as though slavery never should have been in the civilized, high moral Christian nations, white European nations in the first place. If they really believed the gospel, they really believed the Bible, why would slavery would have existed in the first place? Let's continue.
I've even heard people say like, oh, but there were some of the Irish who were indentured. Like, yeah, slavery. Look at the numbers, look at the time, look at the level of work. You could not work toward your freedom. For most black people in America, this was a time when you lived and died as a slave. And so
now right there there are people who are trying to say, excuse me, even to the point that there were more black, I've heard people say this, that there were more black slave owners in the United States than whites. Okay, but certainly they try to use the term, the issue of whether or not there were black slave owners, which is irrelevant, because as I often respond is, tell me about the laws. See, tell me about the laws that were enacted for slavery. Did they benefit black slave owners? Could black slave owners own white slaves? It is really nonsense to even respond to that, because it kind of just shows the evil callousness of people who try to perpetuate that lie. Slavery, the Atlantic slave trade, more than any time in history, was the only slave trade that targeted a single race. That's the difference. Now, I'll get more into that. Let's continue.
that's what reparations is about.
The other thing, I have a slight sidebar in there on the history of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
The history of slavery existed all over the world for thousands of years among all sorts of people, as far back as the history of the human species goes. It's one of many evils that the left tries to localize, when in fact it is a universal evil.
So let's unpack that. And again, he knows better. And I just said what is different in the Atlantic slave trade. So let's go back for a moment. He is correct. Slavery has been around since the beginning of man. From a Christian perspective, the beginning of sinful man. And the thing is that if you were a weaker tribe, a weaker person, you were a slave. You got conquered. But back then, they didn't target a particular race of people. It was really anyone that they conquered. So when we come to the Atlantic slave trade, that's when, through the European colonization, they begin to target a single race of people. And this is when you also begin to see, 14th, 15th century, the language targeting black people, that they were inferior, that they were criminals, that they were less than. Okay? The other problem is that America is the only unique country, right? Remember, that's Christian. They carry the title of Christian. So right there, along with the slavery, remember they said that we hold these truths self-evident, that all men are created equal. Now, no other nation did that, by the way. They never said that all men were created equal. But America said that. America said that all men were endowed with inalienable rights from the Creator. America said that. Now, name me any other nation in which Dr. Sowell is referring to that had those creeds, that had those beliefs, which makes America the biggest hypocrite, right? Because they came in the name of Christianity and yet enslave people. They admitted that we're creatures of God. See, they admitted that, and yet they said that all men are created equal. They said they've been endured from endure with inalienable rights, and yet they took those rights away. There was about 157 years from 1619 when the first slaves landed on American soil to about 1776. So you had generations upon generations of slaves who were born on this land, and that's important because during the 17th and 18th century, one of the prides of America was through what people called themselves natural born, native born people. In fact, the natural born people discriminated against even European immigrants. Some of the immigration laws that we fight against, that you hear on our television, they said these things back in the 18th century, but they set them against the Irish, the Italian, those immigrants, and they considered them not naturally born. It wouldn't be to a few decades later that they were engrafted as white. Whites needed the numbers. I digress. But the natural born citizens, because they had natural born rights, they were born on this soil. We hold this true today. If a person is born on American soil, he is a citizen with all the rights, he's entitled to all the rights of an American citizen. Why? Because he's born here. Well, you had generations upon generations, and the same people who were engrafted in 1776, right, when America broke away from Britain and became a nation. Well, who were the citizens? Those who were born here, except slaves who, from 157 years worth of slaves being born in 1776, they were deprived. Excuse me, they were deprived. Okay? So America then is unique in that you can't boast that they ended slavery. I'm jumping ahead a little bit here. But the fact that they robbed American citizens of their inalienable rights, they robbed black citizens of their natural citizenship. No other nation did that. No other nation had that. Let's continue.
But more than that, as much as slavery is repudiated around the world today, prior to the 18th century, I know of no serious effort to abolish the institution anywhere.
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 Not in Africa, not in the Arabian
not
world.
in Africa in the 21st century. What Adam Smith wrote in
All right, let me break in here, because I was getting ready to say that. I was going to jump ahead. Let me say this, since he talked about what's kind of interesting about what he's saying is a half true. No other nation abolished slavery. The Roman Empire fell, okay? Other nations who are, by the way, pagan nations. India has slaves. India has some 300 million gods that they worship. So the fact that America had slaves made them no better than India. And keep this in mind. When he talks about, and this is no bragging point, because when he talks about that, yeah, America fought because there were good God-fearing people, white people, who stood up and said America was wrong. Same thing in Britain. There were good God-fearing white people who stood up against the establishment and said they were wrong. Now, Britain abolished their slavery decades before America. America stopped importing and exporting slaves in the early 18th century, but still kept the slaves that were already here. It wouldn't be until 1865, remember, they fought the bloodiest war. See, they fought the bloodiest war This is not, to me, a feather in America's cap. Not to say, well, we abolished slavery. Yeah, after you fought the bloodiest war. And then the next 100 years with the civil rights was a bloody, brutal fighting for the rights of black people that culminated in 1965. No feather in the cap here for this. America has been horrible to its own creed, been traitors to their own creed. Let's continue.
1776, that the only place in the world where slavery had been abolished completely was Western Europe. And so this was
As late as the year this country was founded.
yes. And so the idea that this is something that the United States had that nobody else had, or the other countries that didn't have, it's been estimated that there are more slaves in India than in the entire Western Hemisphere. And that's before and after Columbus got here.
Right.
And so
I'll just say this, and I kind of just already said it. If you want to compare yourself to India, India did not have the Christian God, the Christian Bible, the Christian beliefs. America did. All right, let's continue.
I hear what you're saying, but I think that's a completely separate conversation that needs to be had about the now. Because if you are not careful, what you then do is you combine everybody's suffering into the same bowl, and you make it seem like all injustices have the same weighting, and they don't. It's just like crimes. You know, theft isn't the same as murder. We don't try them the same way. And as much as there is a white person who's suffering today, I feel for anybody who's suffering, because I know what it's like to be poor. I know what it's like to suffer. I didn't come from a wealthy family. We struggled when I was growing up. But I also understand that there are levels of that suffering. You know, and so sometimes white people, it does block a white person, because you go white privilege, and a person goes, I'm poor and I'm white. Where's the privilege? You know, white people are like, I wish I could activate my white privilege. I wish I could do it right now. White privilege, give me something.
Let me unpack that. This whole white privilege, the denial of white privilege. Well, first and foremost, understand when you hear phrases such as white privilege, critical race theory, racism itself, these are academic terms. In other words, when people get together and they study and they research and study, they come up with these kinds of phrases, okay? And then, so when we talk about white privilege, what do we mean by white privilege? The idea of white privilege, or even whiteness, means that a white person, by reason of their birth, by reason that they were born white, they are born into a system that favors them. It didn't favor black people. Now, where the confusion coming at is a blue-collar white person will say, look, I struggle, you know, the factory closed in my town, and we struggle. Where's the white privilege? That's not how white privilege is measured. I'll give you an example this way. Let's go to 1920. And let's say here you have a dirt poor white woman. Dirt poor. Can't feed herself, she's hungry, she's homeless. And because she's dirt poor, she hasn't bathed, she stinks, no one wants her around her. But she's white. Because she doesn't have money, she can't eat in the cafe. Because she don't have money. Now, she can't eat. The reason why she's rejected from the cafe is because she don't have money, not because of the color of her skin. Okay? But at any time, because she's born white, if she gets money, she could go in that restaurant in 1920, that cafe in 1920, and eat a meal. Now let's take, for example, a person by the name of Madam C.J. Walker. She was the first black millionaire during this time. She got rich off haircut products and stuff like that. But she was a millionaire back then. By the standards, even back in the 1920s, she was a millionaire. And she bought this. There's a picture of her in a convertible. I believe it's a Cadillac. Okay, and she's sitting up, dressed up. I think there's several people in the car. Let's say they decide to take a ride. They drive down in this nice Cadillac car. They come to the same town as that dirt poor white woman. She pulls up and she stops in front of the cafe. Now, because she's black, Madam C.J. Walker cannot enter into that cafe and eat a meal, though she could purchase the meal. Not only could she purchase the meal, she could have outright bought the cafe because she was a millionaire. But because of the color of her skin, the law forbade her to go in. Madam C.J. Walker could have reached into her purse and pulled out $5 and given it to the dirt poor white woman. The dirt poor white woman then could go right into the cafe that Madam C.J. Walker was forbidden to enter because of the color of her skin. That's white privilege. Doesn't mean that every white person benefits. But what it does mean is that you don't have a nation with its laws, with its religion, with its ideologies, holding back anyone who was white. Yet at the same time, during that time especially, you had that in the case of black people. That's white privilege. Let's continue.
I get that. I get that. Trust me, I get it. It is hard to accept that you have benefits because of the color of your skin if you cannot see the benefits that you have.
The book that I'm writing now, I discovered this is true not only in the United States, it's true in England, and the situation is wholly different. And yet, if you read the data, for example, from London, the educational tests and so forth, you see that there, immigrants from Africa pass this test they have. I'm talking about low-income people now. Nearly 60% of the time. Blacks from the Caribbean, like 50%, so on. Native-born whites in the same low-income bracket pass this test 30% of the time. And it's the same thing. The foreign people come in, they haven't had generations of being steeped in the welfare state vision, the vision of grievances, victimology, and resentments.
Okay, certainly have to unpack this. So let's back up when he talks about immigrants coming here. And this is sort of conflating something, because what he doesn't talk about, why are blacks underperforming in school levels, grade levels, SATs, etc.? And this is extremely important. So we have to go back to 1776. We can actually go back further, because through European colonization, remember, the demonization of black people began. White Europeans began to demonize black people. They were inferior, they were less than. Now, why is that? Because remember, the European colonization, racism spread all over the world, right? So it wasn't only just America who enslaved people, it was a lot of people who enslaved black people. And yes, let me just say this, Africans started it. The birthplace of it was Africa, in that fellow Africans sold Africans into slavery. But are you lowering yourself to the dark continent of Africa, right? To the other pagan nations that I often, just as I spoke of earlier, remember, the white Europeans were supposed to be the Christians. They were supposed to be the more moral ones. But how did they enslave people? How did they how did America justify in their minds that slavery was all right? How did they do that? And this is important. This is important right here. So they, through law, so they passed laws. Slavery was okay. It was written into the Constitution to enslave. Remember, they had to violate their own creed to do this, but to enslave black people was okay. It was legal. So you could go and you can take a black person, make them a slave. That was legal. Okay, you said, so then how did they get over that? They had to mentally condition themselves, they had to not only condition the slaves, which we'll get to in a moment, but white people had to be conditioned that to be able to enslave one of God's creatures, that they said that all men are created equal. In order to have a cognitive dissonance, to bypass that, what did they do? They start saying black people were inferior. They were not human. They would say things like black people didn't have souls, they didn't have emotions. Why would they say something like that? Because the fact that when you would tear their infants from them or their children from them and sell them off, you had to be able to disregard that screams of anguish, to the point now that this is one of the reasons why you see Thomas Sowell talking like he's talking, justifying the brutality of that white people want to so silence the brutality of that because it is horrible. But you have to condition the mind. You have to say that, okay, what we're doing to these human beings, well, they're not human beings. If you wanted to say that they could work longer, right, that they're animals so they can work longer, well, why do you say that? Because slaves worked from sun up to sundown. The conditioning of the mind here. So you did that through, first and foremost, law. It's legal to do that. Which is always interesting to me, that if black people were the animals that white people claim, why were the white masters sleeping with them? I digress. Another way that they had to condition the minds of white people that slavery was okay and racism was okay, they did it through science. Now that's why, again, they came up with pseudoscience. Black people were inferior in every way to white people, that they were not normal. When you talk about the 3/5 rule, law that was wrote into the Constitution, understand that was a win for the South because it was a political move. I'm not going to get into it, but it was a political move. They were trying, remember, when you're talking about representation, the more people you have, the more representation you have, the more power you have in Washington. With the southern states tried to count their slaves. They tried to count their slaves as whole to get more representation. The northern said, "Oh, you can't do that because they're slaves." And then they came up with the 3/4 compromise. It was still a win for them because guess what? 3/5 of a human being is better than not being able to count them at all. But they did that. So so you had the law, and then you had the science to say that black people were inferior, although there was never any science anywhere that could justify that, right? But then the other way that they justify and condition slave, that they condition, was through religion, Christianity. How do you do that, right? But they did. The curse of Ham, dark skin. It's God's will for segregation. That is held to this very day. The Southern Baptists was started in 1846, 1840, I think 1845, 1846, supporting slavery. The largest Protestant denomination today started under slavery, the support of slavery. All right, so that's, remember, so that's how white people justify that. They use the same law, science, and religion to condition black people, and of course they were more brutal. The beatings, they had no rights. They were treated as no rights. This is why the term nigger comes in, because that's how you use that word to condition. You didn't say you were a man. You never said ma'am, yes ma'am. No, you were a property. You were an animal. Right? That's one of the reasons why we have light-skinned black people, is because massa could go and rape. And think about this. He did it in front of families. Go down to slave quarters and just rape a daughter, a wife, a sister, an aunt, maybe even a man. Okay? But guess what? Everybody said that was okay. See, the conditioning of that. But think of the trauma that decades and decades, think of the trauma that it produced. It was illegal for slaves to learn how to read. Now remember, in 1865, think about this, after all of that time of the brutality of slavery, in 1865, what did the nation do? What did the nation do to say, we've had decades, right? We had 200, I believe, in 40 years of slavery against these people. How do we help them? How do we acclimate them into society? In 1865, many slaves didn't even believe they were free. But what could they do in this freedom? Then you had, remember, the South passed Jim Crow laws. Since we cannot profit from slaves, let's throw them away. Jim Crow was the segregation. And it was equally brutal. You could murder a black person. You can lynch and murder. People talk about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Well, Tulsa, Rosewood, East St. Louis, Alton St. Louis. We can go on and on and on of nations across that were burned to the ground, right? Mobs destroyed prospering black cities. What do you think was the trauma behind that? Now that's important to understand, because even right now, it has been over 20 years since 9/11, and America still suffers the trauma of that. If there was a low-flying jet plane just flying low, New York would freak out right now. That's the trauma. Right now, people would freak out if they saw a low-flying jet plane. That happened in around 2000, I want to say 2010, when the Obama administration decided they were going to do some aerial photos of Air Force One flying around New York, and they flew low. They just forgot to tell New York City that it was that way, and so people saw a huge jumbo jet flying low and they freaked out. That's trauma. We understand that trauma. What Thomas Sowell is doing right now, which to me is despicable, is to diminish this, to say that trauma means nothing. What was done to black people for 240 years, let's add another 100 years of Jim Crow. So from 1619, 1776, 1865 to 1965, what Thomas Sowell basically is saying is that trauma, that what was done to black people means nothing. I'm going to pick this up in part 3 next time, guys. And again, we're unpacking this. All right, I will talk to you in part 3. Oh, let me tell you this. Don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP the Bible Perspective. Love to hear your opinions and your thoughts. Remember, all opinions, all views are welcome. So add them to the comment section below. I'll see you next time.